Hey friends, hope everybody's doing well. So this is the scene I'm going to attempt today. Got a nice creek cutting through basically the middle. Moving up to the left, we got these dead trees, dead grass, and then a really nice, very washed out looking sky. The vibe I'm going to go for with this one is subdued colors. And I think I want that creek to pop out a little more than it is in the photo. I think I'm going to exaggerate the colors in that creek. And I also want the background to be fuzzy looking, more indistinct and fuzzy than it is in the photo. I'm just kind of thinking through my process out loud as far as the changes I'm going to make in my painting versus what's in the photo. This is only a reference photo. I don't have to copy it exactly as it is. And to help me with that whole process, as always, I've done a value study, breaking the scene up into 3 values: light, middle, and dark. Light represented by the white of the paper. And then I painted the middle and darks in Payne's gray. And as you can see, I've made one big shape. Everything that I've chosen to include within the middle value tone is connected to everything else that is also middle value. Everything is touching. And then within that big middle value shape, I've painted a few areas of darks within that. And that'll help accentuate certain areas of the painting, create a little bit more separation in that shape, and help bring out some of the details. Now I have a roadmap that I can follow for my painting because I've literally already painted it once, so I've had kind of a practice round. I've also made sure that I like the composition, that I like how everything is flowing, and I do. So we'll just go ahead and get right into it. Grab my sponge, wet down both sides of the paper. I'm wetting down both sides of the paper so that my paper lays flat without having to tape it down. This will also allow the paper to stay wet for a longer period of time. So that gives me more time to work wet into wet, especially in the first wash, which is the light colors. So, just making sure it's wet as evenly as I can get it. If there are any areas that are more wet than others, the paper can start to buckle, and I don't want that. I'm just painting on Arches Cold Press 10 by 14 size, my usual size. Alright, so, and I'm gonna have my spray bottle handy for if I need to re-wet anything. If something's drying out too fast, I can just wet it down with a spray bottle. It's a very useful, very cheap thing you can have in your painting arsenal. I highly recommend getting one if you don't already have one. So we're gonna see if we can represent this washed out sky. So we're gonna start with some cerulean blue. It's gonna be very light, and I want to try to get a nice gradient as it moves towards the horizon, and as it does move down towards the horizon, I'm going to be adding in just some warm colors. So we'll start at the top, using a nice big quill brush that holds a ton of water. And between this big brush and the fact that the paper is so wet, this is going to help me get a nice smooth gradient. Which is always what I'm trying to go for with my skies, that nice gradient as it gets lighter towards the horizon. It's kind of tricky to get the hang of, and I'm still learning how to do it. And so I think what I'm going to do is, now that I've got this warm color, I'm going to start at the horizon like this, and then work that up a little bit, like that. Then I'm going to get back into my blue and then blend that back down again. So I'm kind of moving up and down and meeting in the middle. Yeah, something like that, I think. Might even lift up a little paint towards the horizon. It could look like there's misty clouds or something going on back there. I think I lifted up a little too much, so I'm just going to get that warm color and drop it back in. Just a little bit. I'm trying to keep my brush flat as I move back and forth across the page. Yeah, I think that'll work pretty well. I can already tell I'm going to need to re-wet this area. I need to keep life in the paper. I don't want anything to dry out in the first wash. I want it all to look like one clean, smooth wash. So we're going to essentially tone the paper with this warm color. This looks pretty dark right now, but it will dry a lot lighter than this. Watercolor dries several tones lighter than when you first put it down. That's something you've always got to keep in mind when you're doing watercolor. Yeah, we can start getting more playful with the colors, kind of hinting at all the different colors going on. Just yellow ochre, burnt umber. We'll throw some burnt sienna in there too. There's some kind of reddish foliage going on up here. Over here too, maybe. That's a little too intense, so I'm going to spread that around. Yeah. And I'm being mindful of where that creek is, because I'm going to be putting a different color in there. Just a bunch of warm colors, yellows, browns, earthy reds. Now for this creek, it's kind of a muddy greenish brown color, and then it's a little lighter blue as it's back here. So let's see how we're going to do that. Yellow ochre is always a good bet if you want a more earthy kinds of green. Yeah, that looks about right. We'll just go nice and bold with that. Since most of this river is going to be darker middle value, I might come back in with gouache and paint those You can see a little bit of ripples happening right here. Give some movement to the water, some energy. There's even a few areas where it's just like yellow looking, like right here. Water is always so compelling to paint. It's every single time you paint water, it's going to be a different story. That's what makes it so challenging. But that's also what makes it so fun. So we're just hinting at that more blue color as that creek recedes into the distance there. And just like that, first wash is basically done. Now, something I'm finding is that in my paintings, my ground always looks too smooth and flat and like it lacks texture, and that's fine. I can usually just come back at the end when everything is dry and then add the texture there. But I've been wanting to try adding that texture earlier on in the process while things are still wet. So I think we're going to just do a little bit of experimentation today. So like this foliage right here, I can start kind of just hinting at some of this middle value stuff going on. Now the sharp details like the branches and all that kind of stuff, I'm not going to be able to do until the page is dry. I just wanted to start hinting at some of this texture going on the ground. And then remember that I also mentioned these distant trees, I need them to be fuzzy and indistinct. I need to be able to portray a sense of depth and a feeling that this scene recedes way back into the distance and has many layers to it. We're trying to create illusions of depth and distance on a flat, two-dimensional piece of paper. It's really all we're doing as artists, creating the most convincing illusion that we can. So, with that being said, let's actually get into those background trees right now. There are some trees way far back here. I'm going to make that quite blue. That is another thing that will help distant objects appear more distant, as if they are more blue in tone. The reason for that is there's more atmosphere that distant objects have to go through for the light bouncing off that object to reach your eye. So the more distant they are, the more blue they will appear. Now, the thing is, if you look at the reference photo, these trees are not blue at all. They're kind of like a faint green, kind of, I think. But I want them to look much farther away than they appear in the photo. The thing with photos, and something you have to be aware of if you're painting from photos and not doing plein air where you're painting outside, is that things can tend to appear flat and compressed. And that sense of distance and scale can be lost a little bit. but there's things that you can do to exaggerate that, and making background objects more blue, even if they aren't blue in the photo, is a way that I found to do that pretty effectively. And now we're going to start working up towards these trees over here. These are also going to be more blue, but a little less than the very distant trees in the background. That will help bring them forward a little bit in the scene. So just loosely dropping in the rough shape of the canopy of these trees. And I will go back and add in the sharp details like the trunks and the branches later on, once everything is more dry. Yeah, between things being nice and fuzzy like that and more blue, it just creates this beautiful sense of depth and distance. Alright, now I need this to dry out a little bit more, and then I will start working in the sharper details, and we'll get a nice contrast between soft edges and hard edges. So I'll be right back once this is dry. Okay, now that things have dried out a little bit, but not completely, I'm going to start dropping in some of the trunks of these trees. I really like the sense of scale that you get in this scene. You're almost seeing an entire forest scene all at once. It's a very interesting scene. Start getting some of that nice texture in there of this foliage. It's more of a subdued green color. And this is where my value study is just so useful, because I have a very good idea of what I'm painting, because I already painted it once. I'm just following my roadmap, really. It's all been done already. You notice that this entire stand of trees was included in the mill value shape. So a lot of these trunks and branches are actually going to get painted over in dark later. Kind of spray the tops of those so that they will naturally fuzz up. Kind of looks like the trees are disappearing into the sky, and that's especially useful with the more distant trees. And for the trees that are closer up, like this one, we'll keep it more hard-edged, and that will help tell your mind when you're looking at this that this tree is closer. I'm letting all of these shapes touch and flow into each other. This tree has a nice cast shadow, goes down into the creek. Just like that. And that shadow will connect with the shadow side of this bank here. Keeping an eye on this side of the painting. Don't want it to get completely dry before I go back to it. And in fact, I'm probably going to go back to it right now before it dries out on me. Often referring back to my value study, making sure I'm following the map as I laid it out for myself. There's really beautiful colors going on here. Very subtle colors, but there's a lot of variety happening. Nice contrast between warm colors and cool colors. I'm just kind of hinting at the texture that this is grass. I'm doing these little short vertical strokes. Just here and there. Just enough to get the idea across. So what I did there is I splayed out the end of that brush, and that lets me get a nice grass texture. Especially at the edge of the shape. Just following my value study, that's all I'm doing. Painting the same thing again, just in color. Come back when this is all dry and add some texture and a little more yellow color to that ground. But before we do that, we'll paint this river or this creek. I'm from Arizona, so any moving body of water is a river to me. Start hinting at some of those ripples with some dry brush marks. And we can just dab a little gouache in there, here and there, if we need to later to make it extra sparkly. Water turns more yellow right here. Just bringing it right up into that shadow of the bank, letting that physically touch. There's also a cast shadow from this tree crossing the water, but I'll add that back in a minute. And the water gets slightly more blue. All right, that middle value shape is looking like it's almost done here. I'm liking how the background trees are looking really fuzzy. I think that's just such a cool effect. Now I'm just gonna think about the next steps here. So I know I need the ground to have a lot more texture than it does. I'm talking about the lightest parts of the ground. It's just too flat. I also need to paint these distant trunks. There's a few areas of dark that I need to add in still. I need things to dry out just a little bit before I do that, so I will be right back. Okay, we should be dry enough to start working in some of those sharper details. These trunks back here. It's still slightly damp, which is what I want, because this is the background still, so I need things to be more indistinct. Creating the illusion of a lot of detail without actually painting all of the detail, if that makes sense. Just painting a few of these more noticeable and distinctive looking trunks and branches, just here and there, and then let the viewer's mind fill in the rest on its own. You just have to suggest to their mind what's going on, and then their brain will be able to fill in the rest of the details. And that way you're letting the viewer participate in the creation of the art. And I think that's pretty cool. Oh yeah, there's that cast shadow going across the water there. I'm going to paint that before this dries out too much so that it's a fuzzy shadow. Yeah. Cast shadows across the surface of water are always interesting. They tend to be fuzzier. Just giving some shape to this foliage here. Adding these darks will help distinguish individual clumps of foliage. And you'll actually get these layers that move back farther and farther. There's a few little saplings sticking up here, but I need to wait for this to dry before I add those. Timing is so important with watercolor. You have to wait for things to dry if you want to paint more fine details. And you have to paint while things are wet if you want things to be fuzzier and more flowy and abstract and indistinct. There's just so much you gotta be thinking about. And I am going to come back in with gouache and add the highlights to the top of these twigs and branches, these two piles right here. I think that's a really cool feature, a little bit of eye candy. Yeah, that looks really pretty. What a beautiful scene. So this side is looking mostly good to go. So I need to work on the right side now. need to do a glaze of the ground area and make it a little less bright, so I need to let everything dry out completely before I do that, so I'll be right back. So I'm just going to get a light glaze of a yellowish kind of color. And the reason I needed everything to dry out first is so I can just paint right over everything without picking up the paint that's underneath and making everything a muddy mess. That looks a lot more cohesive now, I think. You can just add some more texture. Stipple this brush around while everything is damp. Now it looks a lot less flat. So adding in a few highlights now, just the top of these branches over here, these dead branches. Some sparkles to this water. Just dry brushing with gouache on here to get that kind of effect of fast moving water. There were a few areas up here I wanted to lighten up a little bit, so I can set the stage for doing that. I'll just drop a little gouache in there. I'll take this same brush and just get it damp, clean and damp, and then I'll just kind of smooth this out. The water was looking a little too flat and monotonous. So if you lighten up a few areas of it like this, it just makes it look a little more like water for some reason. Right here too, just a little bit. Yeah. Gives it kind of a glowing vibe. Lighten this area up a little too. I tried to lift up the paint earlier, but it was already too dry. But you can get basically the same effect with gouache. Yeah, that looks so much better. It really does. Amazing what a little tiny bit of gouache can do. And it really is just the most minuscule amount. I've already had this tube for like 2 years, and I'll probably have it for another 3 years or more. Well, I'm getting pretty close to being done with this scene, I would say. And as probably last final touch, I'll throw some birds in the sky. And since our eyes are kind of being led towards this point right here, the river is flowing that way, this shape moves that way, this shape kind of narrows as it goes this way, I'll draw a flock of birds that look like they're starting over here and then expanding out to just further emphasize that movement that we're seeing in this composition. I'll make it look random, but it won't be random at all. I'll be very intentional with where I place the birds, and that's kind of a thing you have to practice, is painting birds in a way that looks random, but that also serves your composition. Because you can't just throw birds anywhere you want in the sky, or it could look awkward. I mean, as far as the shape of the birds go, they're kind of just like V shapes, roughly. You can throw those few squiggles in there every now and then. Yeah, something like that. It's crazy what you can actually get away with in painting. As long as a few of the birds look something like birds, your mind will just fill in the gaps and assume that the rest are birds too. Just bring a few over here. Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to call that a finished painting. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I hope I see you on the next one.